Hello friends out in YouTube land. Welcome to another evening neurology chit chat with Dr. Reeves. So you have Parkinson's disease, or somebody you know has Parkinson's disease, or it's time to learn about Parkinson's disease because you have to write a paper on it. Let's talk about Parkinson's disease. First, it's a little bit of a vocabulary lesson. First is Parkinsonism is a description. Parkinsonism is a description of how someone moves, how they can behave, how they stand, how they walk, how their voice is, if they have tremor, that kind of thing. Parkinsonism is a description. And so I often think of that as kind of like an umbrella description. So saying somebody has Parkinsonism is like saying they have knee pain or back pain. It's a who and a what and a where, but it isn't a why. So underneath that umbrella description, there are many disorders that cause Parkinsonism. You can get Parkinsonism from certain medications. You can get Parkinsonism from certain diseases. You can get Parkinsonism from, not too often, but occasionally strokes. You can get Parkinsonism because the circuits are degenerating and wearing out in some parts of the brain. I call that a degenerative disorder. And even in the world of degenerative causes of Parkinsonism, there are many different diseases. Now, Parkinson's disease is the most frequent one. It's the most well-known one, and obviously that's kind of where the name came from. So Parkinson's disease is the most common degenerative disorder causing Parkinsonism. Now, presuming that someone doesn't have Parkinsonism from drugs that they're taking or something like that, or some other treatable cause, then we usually are dealing with a degenerative disorder. Parkinson's disease is the most common, but there are others like diffuse Lewy body disease, cortical basal ganglionic degeneration, sometimes FTD, sometimes blah blah blah. It's all the alphabet soup of neurologic degenerative disorders, which, if you're a neurologist, is very fascinating to tease apart. And we tend to get into fistfights over, well, what does this patient have? Do they have diffuse Lewy body disease or Parkinson's disease, whatever? At the end of the day, though, our ability to treat them is about the same on purpose. Now, tonight's talk is about Parkinson's disease as the most common Parkinsonism. And I'm going to present this as kind of a what I would want to know if I or somebody I loved had developed the disorder. And I say that because I'm not speaking from a neuroscientist point of view. In other words, I'm going to paint with a little bit of a broad brush. I'm not, we can talk about the fascinating aspects of the substantia nigra, pars reticulata versus the pars compacta, and the dopaminergic stimulation and the indirect and indirect pathways. That's all fascinating if you're a neuroscientist, but it doesn't help you deal with Parkinson's disease. So I don't know if you can hear in the background, but Jake the cat is stealthily approaching from below. We'll see if we get a visit. So, painting with my broad brush, kind of with one exception. Parkinson's disease is a disorder of not enough movement. Now, the exception is the tremor, where you can say there's an extra movement. Not everybody with Parkinson's disease has tremor. Just want to get that out there. Every symptom I'm going to talk about, there's someone with Parkinson's disease who doesn't have it, or doesn't have it yet. So it's kind of a constellation of things. So with one exception of the tremor, generally Parkinson's disease is a disorder of not enough movement. So what does that mean? That means that if you pay attention to how often people blink, and I do, how often they wave their hands about. Are you capable of speaking without moving your hands? Well, I'm not. But if I got Parkinson's disease, that might actually kind of tend to fall away. These movements that you don't think about. You're talking and you kind of turn your head and you squint your eye a little bit. Those tend to fall away, and so people tend to look a little bit more like this. And they don't move the muscles of their speaking and their voice box as much. And so the ups and downs tend to get a little bit more muted, and people get a little bit softer like that, and they just sort of sit here like this and they talk like, which of course looks like someone is depressed. And so sometimes people who are developing Parkinson's disease initially are felt to just have depression. Little sidebar here. Depression is rampant in people with degenerative neurologic disorders like Parkinson's disease. So I'm not suggesting that everything that looks like depression in a Parkinson's patient is actually just Parkinson's. Okay, I'm not saying that, but just saying that from how things look superficially, you walk by them, in the supermarket, you might get that impression. Speaking of walking, it's not enough movement. So when they walk, they don't move the feet out quite as far, so they take shorter steps. They don't lift, they don't move their feet up off the ground as much, so they kind of shuffle. They don't swing the arm as much, usually on one side more than the other. When they get off balance, the natural reflexes to kind of correct our balance don't move as quickly. And so when somebody comes up and pushes you, you have these natural reflexes that you don't consciously do anything about, and you move your body to counteract that. Well, you get a little bit off balance, and you have Parkinson's disease, your reflexes don't move you fast enough, and so gravity happens and falls are increased. So reduced blink rate, softer voice, reduced movements overall, particularly the face, head, neck, hands, and arms. Reduced movement of the legs. We're walking, leading to shuffling, getting ahead of your feet. You can't bring your feet forward far enough, and you get ahead of yourself. Falls because of the balance issue. And then the tremor that I talked about, which isn't always there. Most prominent is the rest tremor. So when somebody moves the hand, the tremor goes away for a second, and they put it down, it's actually gone for a second, and then after a little bit it starts creeping in. Tends to like to really affect sort of the thumb, index finger area first. Almost always it begins more on one side than another. It's usually in the hand, but sometimes we actually see it in the leg. Not as common, but it can happen. So these are the kind of the major motor disorders of Parkinson's disease. There are people who have another movement, an extra movement. It's clearly not as common, and that's what we call a dystonia, where there's an abnormal, sustained contraction, often in the head and neck area, but it can be other areas too. More common in people who begin with Parkinson's disease very young, can occur later in the course of Parkinson's disease in older adults. Clearly not as common of a thing. And so that's a quick Cook's tour of the motor-ish sides of Parkinson's disease. Little junior Cook's tour of the non-motor symptoms. And actually, the non-motor symptoms, if you do really good studies, they typically begin first. The non-motor symptoms are all over the place. That includes changes in the movement of the intestines, so people may get constipation. It includes the change in regulation of some of the circuits in the brainstem that have to do with whether we're paralyzed when we're dreaming. Now, it's normal to be paralyzed when you're dreaming. In your dream, you're running away from the big Kool-Aid monster or something, and you're lying in your bed and you're not actually running. That's because kind of a switch is thrown in your brainstem, if you will, and that switch paralyzes the arms and legs. In certain people who are either have Parkinson's disease, or in some people who are going to develop Parkinson's disease, that switch doesn't really work very well, and so in their dreams they are kind of hollering out and thrashing and all the way up to getting up and running down the hall. I had one patient who he must have had pretty violent dreams, because he'd get up and he'd fight people in his dream. He kicked holes in the drywall and everything, and he was completely asleep in all of this. So there are other non-motor symptoms. Often people get a little bit more oil kind of around the face and forehead, and so kind of flaky skin gets there. People may have changes in their blood pressure regulation, so that when they are going from, say, lying to standing, their blood may pool too much, may run down to their legs too much, and their blood pressure may drop. That tends to occur, if it's Parkinson's disease, that tends to be a little bit more milder and later. If it's a really big problem early on in someone who has Parkinsonism, then we think about another kind of group of diseases, particularly the multiple systems atrophy types of stuff. Again, that's just one of the, MSA is just one of the alphabet soup of degenerative disorders that cause a Parkinsonism. So there's depression, sometimes anxiety, problems with sleep, a lot of aches and pains. Some of this has to do with not moving enough. Often people, if you can't move enough, you can't really roll over well in bed or something like that, and then you get stiff and sore. But also there's just general aches and pains that seem to be increased with Parkinson's disease. So by no means is this a comprehensive tiptoe through all the non-motor Parkinson's symptoms. But I want to give you a taste of things that maybe you need to think about and talk about with your neurologist and keep an eye out for. Plus there's lots of good research you can do on the internet. I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about cause, except to note that yes, there are genetic Parkinson's syndromes. They are clearly the minority, maybe 10% at most. So in the vast majority of cases, it's just what we call idiopathic, which is a fancy doctor word for, I don't know, he's got it. Now, if you've been learning anything about Parkinson's disease, you probably learned about dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical used to transmit messages in the brain, and Parkinson's disease patients have a problem where those nerve cells, neurons we call them, but the nerve cells that make dopamine in a certain area are degenerating and dying off. So there's not enough dopamine being made. It's not just a dopamine story, Parkinson's, because there's acetylcholine producing neurons that are having problems too. So we're not going to go into all the neuroscience, but clearly tweaking dopamine is the big deal in reducing Parkinson's symptoms. So there's about maybe 3 or 4 ways to kind of boost the dopamine. You can't just give dopamine because it doesn't cross from the bloodstream through the gate into the brain. So instead, we can give the raw material that's made into dopamine. That happens to be able to cross into the brain. It's called L-DOPA or levodopa, L-DOPA. And so if you have a reduced number of little dopamine-making factories in part of the brain, and you supply them with more raw material, they can put out more product. So it works like that. And that's how levodopa or Sinemet works. A little sidebar about Sinemet. There's always 2 numbers with the drug, for like 25/100 or 50/200 or something like that. The second number is how much levodopa is in there. That's the raw material that's supposed to get in the brain, get turned into dopamine. The first number is the amount of carbidopa, which is a medication that isn't absorbed into the brain. It can't be absorbed in there, and it prevents the second medicine, the levodopa, from making you throw up. You can give more raw material, comes to the factory, make more dopamine, out we go. You can give a molecule that gets into the brain that isn't dopamine, but it acts like dopamine. It's kind of got the right shape to the key to kind of fit in the lock and get some action going. And we call those dopamine agonists. And they're like pramipexole and ropinirole, Requip and Mirapex, the trade names in the United States. And they help. So you can make more dopamine with more raw material. You can give a compound that acts like dopamine. You can, dopamine, when it's released to do its job, it gets chewed up by enzymes. So you can, third approach is you can inhibit the enzyme that's chewing up the dopamine. So it kind of hangs around longer and it does more dopamine work. Sinemet actually works the best in head-to-head studies in terms of reducing tremor and in other motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It's important to note that nothing that affects Parkinson's disease affects all the myriad symptoms uniformly. So somebody has tremor and maybe they got bad balance and they shuffle, and later in the disease some people drool, okay, usually later, and maybe they have those 4 symptoms, and that's pretty prominent. And you give them Sinemet. They've never taken Sinemet in their life. You give them Sinemet, and maybe the tremor improves 70%, and the walking improves 30%, and the drooling doesn't change at all. And you tend to see that. So there's a rather variable response to the treatments. The tremor with Sinemet, the tremor is probably the symptom that tends to improve the best. And the walking and gait instability, we call it, poor balance, often it doesn't improve as much. Yes, there's exceptions to every rule. Every now and then you see a patient and you put them on Sinemet and they want to try out for the Olympics in gymnastics or something. Okay, great. But generally speaking, you tend to see the best response to the tremor, and not as much response really with the non-motor symptoms at all. So, very quick Cook's tour through treatment of Parkinson's disease and its description, but I would be remiss in not at least touching on another treatment, and that's the deep brain stimulator. We talk about the chemicals. We haven't talked about physical therapy and gait training and all that kind of stuff. We don't have time tonight. Come back another day. Deep brain stimulators, though, we'll just touch on them. Essentially, the guts of this are kind of like a pacemaker, and it's put under the collarbone, typically on one side, sometimes on both. And the wires run under the skin, behind the ear, typically, and under computer guidance, a neurosurgeon and a neurologist put a tiny little wire down into deep in a certain part of the brain, deep brain. Stimulate. They stimulate, and stimulating that circuit in there has the effect of kind of turning it off, and that can change the motor functioning. If Sinemet doesn't help your Parkinson's, deep brain stimulation will not help your Parkinson's. It will make you no better than your best Sinemet state. It tends to worsen some of the problems with dropping your blood pressure or falling over, but it tends to improve what we call on time, meaning moving well and feeling good with the medicine, and reduce the off time. So deep brain stimulators have a role. I'm not against them. It's tough to kind of find the person who's just right for that. They've got the disease long enough, bad enough, but they're not so debilitated from getting demented or having strokes and heart attacks and that kind of stuff that they can still have the surgery. So there is memory loss and dementia that develops with Parkinson's disease. It's not as prominent, it's not as early as what we see with diffuse Lewy body disease and such, other Parkinsonian syndromes. So before we go, I do want to talk about hallucinations. You can get that with Parkinson's disease if you give enough dopamine stimulation. So if you give enough Sinemet or enough dopamine agonists, the things that act like dopamine, you're going to get hallucinations. There are a host of other side effects of Sinemet and the dopamine agonists and etc. that we don't have time to go into. This isn't really the place to do that. That's really a conversation in the office with your physician. But be aware that there are, of course, side effects with every drug. So thank you for watching this long, for those of you who have, and I'll hope to come back soon with another video about some wild neurologic topic that we can dream up. Thanks.
And now is there in the left corner?
Oh yeah, it's blinking.
Now
I can run the camera.